Dawn quietly crawled across the towering glass panels of the Elysian Architectural Tower, headquarters of Graves Design Corporation, where the city's most modern blueprints were sketched. The early light fell on the sharp lines of the steel and ebony interiors, reflecting off the gleaming marble floors. On the top floor, the CEO's office door opened, and Elliot Graves stepped inside. His leather shoes tapped a steady rhythm, like a clock that never lost its beat. At 38, Elliot was the embodiment of cold perfection, an expensive gray suit tailored to his tall, lean frame, dark hair slicked neatly back, and steel gray eyes that always looked straight ahead without a flicker of doubt. But if you look closely, you could see the tired lines etched deep at the corners of his eyes, like cracks in a wall that once seemed unbreakable. Elliot set his leather briefcase on the desk, his gaze sweeping over the cityscape sprawling below. From the 42nd floor, everything looked small, detached, like a painting that had nothing to do with him. He turned on his computer, the screen lighting up with a flood of emails and financial reports. A notification from Human Resources blinked. Restructuring plan. Janitorial staff reduction. Elliot clicked it, skimming the list. More than 20 names, each attached to a family, a story. He didn't read the details. To him, they were just numbers, part of the necessary operations to keep the company at the top of the industry. Graves' design didn't just build structures, it built power, and power demanded ruthlessness. He paused at one name, Lillian Hart. The file stated, female, 34 years old, janitorial staff, 10 years of service without a single day off. No absences, no leave requests, not one violation. Elliot frowned, a flicker of surprise crossing his face. Then he shrugged. Dedication wasn't a factor he was considering today. He quickly signed her termination order, his signature sharp as a blade. Just one more name in a long list, nothing more. He hit send, and the document disappeared into the system as if it had never existed. The morning passed in meetings. Executives presented expansion plans, profit figures dancing across the giant screen. Elliot listened, nodded, issued instructions in a deep, clear voice, devoid of emotion. But in his mind, a corner of memory always threatened to resurface. 5 years ago, on a rainy night, the wail of an ambulance siren had torn through the darkness. His daughter, Emma, only 5 years old, was gone forever in a car accident. He hadn't been there when it happened. He'd been at the office, like every day, buried in work. That pain had never faded, but Elliot had learned to lock it away, deep in his chest where no one could reach it. He didn't speak about Emma. No one in the company dared mention her. To them, Elliot Graves was a machine, and machines had no heart. Close to noon, Elliot returned to his office, closing the door to block out curious eyes. He picked up the phone and dialed Lillian Hart's number. He wanted to deliver the termination himself, not because he cared, but because he needed to make sure everything was handled cleanly. A tidy job, just like he always operated. The phone rang 3 times before someone answered, but the voice that came on the line wasn't an adult's. It was small, trembling, like wind slipping through a crack in the door. Hello? Elliot froze, his hand tightening around the receiver. I need to speak with Lillian Hart, he said, his tone rigid. Silence for a moment. Then the little girl's voice returned, weak but steady. Mommy is sick. She can't talk right now. I'm Sophie. Elliot felt a jolt run down his spine. Sophie. The name pierced his memory like a needle. Emma used to call him that way, her voice clear and full of trust. He forced himself to keep his tone calm. How old are you, Sophie? I'm 6, she replied, her voice a little hesitant. Who are you? He took a slow breath, trying to focus. I'm your mommy's boss. I need to talk about her job. Another pause. Then Sophie spoke again, her voice shaky but filled with determination. Mister, Mommy is really sick. She has a fever. She can't go to work. But I can go clean instead of Mommy. I know how to mop the floor. I'm really good at it. Please don't fire Mommy, okay? Please. Elliot felt his throat tighten. The little girl's words were like a stone dropped into the calm surface inside him, sending ripples he couldn't control. He pictured a 6-year-old standing in some small room, clutching the phone, trying to save her mother's job. The image was too much like Emma, the little girl who used to hold his hand, begging him to stay a little longer before bedtime. "Sophie," he said, his voice rough without realizing, "you don't have to do anything. I'll talk to your mommy later." "But, mister," Sophie pleaded, "if I clean really well, will you let mommy keep her job?" "I promise I'll do a good job." Elliot didn't answer right away. He set the phone down on the desk, his hand unsteady. He wasn't used to this feeling, this sense of losing control. In his world, everything had an order, a plan. But Sophie's voice, small and so sincere, had unraveled it all. He looked out the window, where the city kept moving without pause. But this time he didn't see the distance. He saw a little girl, a mother, and a family standing on the line he himself had drawn. He picked up the phone again. "Sophie, where are you right now?" "At home," she said. "Mommy's lying down. I'm taking care of her." Elliot quickly jotted down the address Sophie recited, her voice breaking as if afraid she'd say it wrong. He didn't know why he was doing this. Maybe because he needed to see for himself. Maybe because, in one rare moment, he didn't want to be the machine everyone believed him to be. "I'll come by to check on things," he said, his tone stiff to hide his confusion. "Just stay there with your mommy, all right?" "Yes, sir," Sophie replied, her voice brightening a little. "Thank you." The call ended, but Elliot couldn't go back to work. He sat in his chair, still holding the phone tight. Emma's image washed over him again, the little girl with golden hair and a radiant smile, who once called him Daddy in those brief, happy days. He had lost her, and since then, he had lost himself. But Sophie's voice, in just those few short minutes, had made him feel something he thought had died long ago. Connection. He stood, took his coat, and walked out of the office. The employees stared at him in shock. Elliot Graves never left in the middle of the workday. But he didn't care. He needed to know who Sophie was. He needed to know who Lillian Hart was. And more than anything, he needed to understand why his heart, frozen for so many years, had started to beat in a way he could no longer control. You're watching Soul Stories, where every story whispers of love, healing, and hope. Let us know which city you're watching from. Don't forget to subscribe and be a part of our journey. Now stay with us. The story is just beginning. The cold, early winter wind slipped through the car window, carrying the sharp chill of the city at dawn. Elliot Graves drove his sleek black Bentley down the narrow streets, leaving behind the dazzling lights of downtown, where his Elysian Tower reigned. His destination was the industrial district on the west side, where old apartment blocks stood crowded together like tired giants forgotten by time. He wasn't familiar with this place. The winding roads, cracked sidewalks, and the faint smell of dampness in the air made him feel out of place. But Sophie's voice, small and trembling over the phone, still echoed in his mind like a melody he couldn't shut off. The apartment building came into view, a gray concrete mass with long cracks like veins running across the walls. The narrow stairwell, coated in dust, led up to the third floor. The hallway was freezing, lit by the flickering glow of a worn-out fluorescent bulb that made the peeling paint look even more desolate. Elliot stopped in front of Unit 304, the address Sophie had recited over the phone. The old wooden door was ajar, a tiny crack revealing a sliver of weak light inside. He knocked softly, but there was no answer. Hesitating just a moment, he pushed the door open and stepped inside. The apartment was small, so stark in its simplicity that it made him pause. A worn-out armchair sat by the window, where pale daylight filtered through a thin curtain. A small wooden table, scratched and dented, held a water jug and an empty medicine box. There were no rugs, no pictures, only the bare essentials of a hard life. In the corner, on the armchair, lay Lillian Hart, motionless. Her face was pale, eyes half closed. A thin blanket was draped over her, but it wasn't enough to ward off the cold seeping through the room. "Mister?" A small voice called from the doorway. Elliot turned, and for the first time he saw Sophie. She was tiny, her brown hair a tangled mess, tied back hastily with a red elastic band. Her wide, pale blue eyes watched him with a mix of curiosity and worry. In her arms was an old stuffed rabbit, its fur matted and one ear torn, but clutched as if it were the most precious thing in the world. Sophie wore an oversized sweater, probably her mother's with sleeves that fell over her small hands. "Sophie," Elliot said, his voice unconsciously softening. He knelt down to her eye level, not even realizing he was doing it. "You're Sophie, right?" The girl nodded, her gaze never leaving his. "You're Mommy's boss, aren't you? Did you come to fire Mommy?" Her voice quivered, but there was a strange resilience in it, as if she was used to facing things far bigger than herself. Elliot shook his head, but the words caught in his throat. He looked over at Lillian, lying half-conscious on the chair, stirring weakly. She whispered, her voice thin as air. "I'm sorry. I can't come to work. I'm sorry." Lillian tried to sit up, but her body trembled, sweat beading on her forehead. She coughed dryly, her frail hand clutching the edge of the blanket, as if trying to hold on to the last bit of strength she had. Elliot rose and walked toward her. He wanted to say something, but Sophie's eyes stopped him. The girl stepped forward, carefully set her stuffed rabbit on the floor, and took his hand. Her small hand was icy cold, but the gentle touch was strangely warm. "Mister, please don't be mad at Mommy," Sophie pleaded, her voice urgent. "She's everything to me. Mommy works so hard, but she's sick now. I promise I'll help her. Please don't fire her, okay?" Sophie's words were like a blade cutting through the shell Elliot had built around himself for years. He, who always kept everything under control, suddenly found himself unable to speak. The cold explanations about business efficiency he'd prepared melted away. In their place, he saw Emma, his lost daughter, in Sophie's clear eyes. The same fragility, the same innocent belief that grown-ups could fix everything. He sat down beside Sophie, right on the cold floor, not caring that his expensive suit might get dirty. "I'm not angry at your mom," he said, his voice hoarse, strange even to his own ears. "I just wanted to see how she was." Sophie looked at him, and her eyes brightened just a little. "You're really nice," she said, then ran to the corner of the room and picked up a carefully folded wet cloth. "I was cleaning Mommy's face to help her fever go away. But I don't know what else to do." Her voice trailed off as if she was afraid she'd done something wrong. Elliot looked at Lillian, the woman he'd only known as a few lines on a personnel report. She was so thin, her dark hair matted with sweat, but her face still held a gentleness, even in her fever. He remembered her file, 10 years of work without a single missed day, not one complaint. A woman who had quietly given so much to his company, and he had never paid attention. Now, seeing her lying there, so weak and helpless, a slow shame crept into his chest. "You're taking good care of your mom, Sophie," he said, his voice dropping lower. He rested his hand on her shoulder, a clumsy but genuine gesture. "I'll help. You don't have to worry anymore." Sophie smiled, a faint but radiant smile, like sunlight breaking through fog. She turned back to her mother and began wiping Lillian's forehead again. Elliot stood there unmoving, feeling as though his entire world had been turned upside down. He had come here intending to end an employment contract, but now he couldn't even think about firing Lillian. Not for any noble reason, but simply because Sophie, with her blue eyes and that ragged stuffed rabbit, had touched something in him he thought had died long ago. He pulled out his phone and called his assistant. "Find a doctor. Send them to this address immediately," he ordered, his tone short but no longer cold. When he hung up, he looked at Sophie, who was quietly humming a lullaby to her mother. He didn't know what he was doing, or why he was here in this shabby apartment instead of in his office high above the city. But he knew one thing. He couldn't walk away without doing something for these two people. Lillian Hart's small apartment remained bathed in dim light, as if even the sun was reluctant to touch this place. Elliot stood silently by the doorway, his gaze sweeping over every corner of the room. The smell of antiseptic from the wet cloth Sophie had used to wipe her mother's forehead mixed with the damp odor of the walls, creating a heavy feeling in the air. Sophie was still sitting beside her mother, her small hand clutching the cloth, her eyes full of worry but without a single complaint. The sight sent a sharp ache through Elliot's chest, not his own pain, but the realization of how fragile their lives really were. He walked over to the small wooden table in the corner of the room, where an old refrigerator hummed, the motor rattling as if struggling to hold on to its last breath of life. "Sophie," he called softly, his voice gentler than he expected. Have you eaten anything? She looked up, her eyes bright but hesitant. Yes, I ate, Sophie replied, but her uncertain tone made Elliot suspicious. He opened the refrigerator door, and what he saw made him stop. Inside was only a piece of dry bread, wrapped in a crumpled plastic bag, and a small carton of milk that had expired the week before. Nothing else, no vegetables, no meat, not even a single can of soda. Hunger seemed to be a silent companion in this apartment. Elliot turned to look at Sophie. She had stood up and run to the tiny kitchen corner, where a pot of thin porridge was cooling on an old gas stove. I cooked this for Mommy, Sophie said, her voice full of pride but tinged with worry. But Mommy can't eat it. I don't know how to make anything else. She pointed at the pot, which was just a watery mix of rice and water, no seasoning, no color. Elliot looked at her small hands, red from the cold water, and he felt an unnamed emotion rising in his chest. A 6-year-old child who should have been playing or learning her letters was instead trying to keep her mother alive with the little she had. He knelt down beside Sophie, trying to keep his voice steady. You did a great job, he said, placing a hand on her shoulder. But now let me help, all right? Sophie nodded, her eyes lighting up with a bit of hope. Elliot took out his phone and called his assistant again. Bring food to the address I sent you, he ordered. Hot meals, enough for 2 people, and fresh groceries for a few days. Hurry. He hung up without waiting for a response. He wasn't used to this, feeling the urge to do something not for his own benefit, but simply because it was right. Elliot looked around the apartment again, his eyes settling on a corner of the wall where a small collection of photographs had been carefully taped up. Pictures of Lillian and Sophie through the years: Sophie at 3, grinning under a paper birthday hat, Sophie at 4, hugging her stuffed rabbit in the park, and a recent one, Lillian bending down to kiss Sophie's forehead. They were both smiling, but there was a tiredness in Lillian's smile. He noticed something odd. There were no photos of Sophie as a baby, no newborn pictures, no complete family portraits. Lillian's file at the company clearly stated she was a single mother, but these photos made him wonder if there was something he didn't know about them. Sophie, he asked gently, how long have you and your mom lived here? She lifted her head, thinking for a moment. Since I was very little, she said. Mommy says we're a team, just the 2 of us. Sophie smiled, but her eyes turned a little sad. Elliot felt a question rise inside him, but he didn't want to push her. Maybe Lillian would explain, when she was stronger. Lillian stirred on the armchair, her eyelids fluttering as she tried to open them. Sophie, she whispered, her voice so faint it was nearly inaudible. Sophie immediately ran over and took her mother's hand. Mommy, he came to help us, she said brightly. He's not mad at you. Lillian tried to smile, but her fever only allowed her a small nod. Thank you, Mr. Graves, she whispered, her voice full of shame. I'll come back to work as soon as I can. Elliot shook his head and sat down beside her. You don't need to apologize, huh? He said, his voice low but firm. Just rest. I've called a doctor. Lillian looked at him, her fevered eyes searching for something, maybe suspicion or the punishment she was used to expecting in this hard life. But Elliot's eyes held none of that. Instead, there was a sincerity he didn't realize he was showing. Elliot's personal doctor arrived 15 minutes later, a middle-aged man with gold-rimmed glasses and a professional demeanor. He examined Lillian, wrote out a prescription, and reassured them that it was only a fever caused by exhaustion and a mild infection, but she needed rest and nutrition. Elliot listened carefully, noting every detail, and made sure everything would be arranged: medicine, food, and even a small space heater to warm the cold apartment. While the doctor worked, Sophie sat beside Elliot, clutching her stuffed rabbit. Mister, do you have any kids? She asked, her voice curious. The question felt like a blade to Elliot's heart. He was silent for a moment, Emma's image coming back clearly, his little girl with golden hair, who used to ask him similar questions. I used to, he replied, his voice hoarse, but now it's just me. Sophie tilted her head, studying him with her clear, innocent eyes. Then, are you sad? She asked. I'm sad when Mommy's sick, but Mommy says if you love someone, you're never really alone. Her words, so simple and sincere, made Elliot feel his chest tighten. He looked at her, and for the first time in years, he felt a flicker of warmth breaking through the ice inside him. The doctor left, promising to return that evening, and handed over a list of medications and instructions. Elliot's assistant arrived as well, carrying bags of hot food chicken soup, fresh bread, and a box of fruit. Sophie's eyes lit up as if she were seeing treasure. "Can I eat this?" she asked shyly. Elliot nodded, smiling. "Yes, eat with your mom. I'll stay here for a while." While Sophie carefully spooned soup for her mother, Elliot sat quietly watching them. Lillian, a woman who had worked 10 years without a single day off, and Sophie, a little girl willing to do anything to protect her mother. He thought of Emma, and for the first time, that memory didn't bring only pain. It also carried a small piece of hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, he could do something right. Not just for himself, but for the people who needed him the most. Still following the story? If this story found you outside of Soul Stories, we invite you home to where every touching tale begins with truth, hope, and heart. It was late afternoon when Elliot Graves left the small apartment of Lillian and Sophie. The blazing red sunset poured through the car window, painting the city's busy streets in golden light. But in his mind, the image of that shabby apartment, Sophie's pale blue eyes and Lillian's wan face, kept haunting him. He drove back to the Elysian Tower, where his office perched on the very top floor like a lonely spire in the sky. But this time, the quiet of his office no longer felt reassuring. It was cold, hollow, and for the first time, Elliot felt he didn't belong there. He sat at his desk, his gaze falling on the computer screen, still displaying the list of janitorial staff scheduled for termination. More than 20 names, each name a story, a life. He had always seen them as numbers to be trimmed to optimize profit. But now, after meeting Sophie and Lillian, those names had come alive. He clicked, reopening Lillian Hart's file. 10 years of work without a single day off, not a word of complaint, never an absence. He scrolled through the other files. Most were women, many single mothers, immigrants, people living at the edges of society who quietly kept Elysian Tower clean and running smoothly. They were invisible, people he had never cared to notice. Elliot stood and walked to the large window overlooking the city. From here, he could see the grand buildings his company had designed, monuments to success. But beneath that glittering surface, he realized he had overlooked people like Lillian, the ones who sacrificed silently to keep his world perfect. He thought of Sophie's question, echoing in his mind like a bell. "Can you be our friend?" That innocent question wasn't just a question, it was a reminder of something he'd lost long ago. Connection, compassion, and the meaning of living for something beyond himself. He returned to his desk, flipping through the restructuring plan documents. The cold numbers, the profit graphs, and the justifications about business efficiency now felt suffocating. Lillian, a woman who worked tirelessly to feed Sophie. Sophie, a 6-year-old girl ready to clean floors to save her mother's job. And Emma, his daughter, who was gone forever, leaving behind a void nothing could fill. For the first time in years, Elliot faced the cruelty within himself, not because he meant to cause pain, but because he had chosen not to see it. The phone on his desk vibrated, a message from his assistant, confirming that the doctor had checked on Lillian again and said she was recovering. More medicine and food had been delivered. Elliot nodded to himself, but the relief only lasted a moment. He knew that helping Lillian today wasn't enough to erase what he had planned for her and dozens of others. He opened a drawer and took out an old fairy tale book, the book Emma had loved, its pages yellowed, filled with drawings of princesses and knights. He had kept it like a treasure, though he had never opened it since the day Emma left. But today he decided he would bring it to Sophie. As night fell, Elliot drove back to the shabby apartment building. In his hand was a large bag of groceries and the fairy tale book. He knocked on the door of apartment 304. This time, Sophie opened it right away. She had changed out of her oversized sweater into pajamas with a little cat pattern, but she still clutched the worn-out stuffed rabbit. "Mister!" Sophie cried out, her eyes shining. "Mommy's better. She can sit up now." Elliot stepped inside and saw Lillian sitting in the armchair, still pale but more alert. She wore an old cardigan, her hair pulled back neatly, and her eyes held gratitude mixed with embarrassment. Mr. Graves, she said, her voice weak but clearer. I, I don't know how to thank you. You didn't have to do all this. Elliot set the bag on the table and shook his head. You don't have to apologize, Lillian, he said, his voice warmer than he expected. You've done more than anyone could. Just rest, and don't worry about work. I'll take care of it. Lillian looked at him, her eyes wide as if she couldn't believe what she was hearing. But the termination order, she whispered, her voice trembling. I heard the company is cutting back. Elliot sat down in the wooden chair across from her, his hands clasped. I'm going to review that, he said, and this time he meant it. He didn't promise anything specific, but Sophie's gaze, so full of absolute trust as she sat beside her mother, made him feel he couldn't break his word. Sophie climbed into the chair and picked up the fairy tale book he had brought. Mister, what's this? She asked, her small fingers brushing the cover. Is it a fairy tale? Mommy used to tell me stories, but we don't have books like this. Elliot smiled a rare, genuine smile. Yes, it's a book I used to read to a very special little girl, he said. I think you'll like it. He didn't mention Emma's name, but his eyes turned sad as he watched Sophie flip through the pages, her eyes lighting up as if she'd discovered treasure. Lillian watched him, her gaze gentle but full of curiosity. Mr. Graves, she said quietly, her voice steady, why are you doing all this? You didn't have to, for someone like me? Elliot was silent for a moment, looking out the window where the dim streetlights glowed. Because I was wrong, he said, his voice low. I forgot that people like you, like Sophie, are what really matter. I want to make it right, even if it's only a little. Lillian didn't say anything, but she nodded, a single tear rolling down her cheek. Sophie, unaware of the tension between the adults, kept turning the pages, softly whispering the words she could read. Elliot stood and placed his hand lightly on Lillian's shoulder. I'll come back to check on you and Sophie, he said. Rest. And call me if you need anything. As he left the apartment, his steps were lighter, but his mind was heavy. He thought about the list of forgotten letters of termination, the people overlooked. Back in his office, he sat before the computer and opened the restructuring plan again. But this time, he didn't see numbers. He saw names. And for the first time, he asked himself, what can I do so no one has to end up like Lillian and Sophie again? 3 days later, night settled over the old apartment complex, bringing a chill that crept through every crack in the walls. The flickering fluorescent lights in the hallway cast unsteady shadows. But inside apartment 304, a faint warmth seemed to flicker to life. Elliot had come to visit Sophie and her mother again. He sat on the small wooden chair, his gaze softer than it had ever been as he watched Sophie, the 6-year-old girl, bent over an old piece of paper, concentrating. She sat cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by scattered crayons, some snapped in half but still used carefully. Lillian, though still weak, was sitting up in the armchair, a thin blanket draped over her shoulders. She smiled at her daughter, her eyes full of love, though tinged with exhaustion. Mister, I'm done, Sophie exclaimed, her voice bright as a little bell. She jumped up and ran over to Elliot, holding out a crayon drawing. He bent down to take the paper from her small hand. The picture unfolded before him, 3 figures drawn in wobbly but colorful lines. A tall man in a blue shirt, clearly meant to be Elliot, with simple dark hair, a woman with long hair standing next to him, and a little girl between them, holding both their hands. Beneath the drawing, Sophie had written in pencil, the letters shaky but clear. Our family? Elliot felt his heart miss a beat. He looked into Sophie's pale blue eyes, waiting for his reaction with a mixture of hope and worry. The word family pierced straight through the armor he had built around himself since losing Emma. But instead of the familiar pain, this time he felt a strange warmth, like sunlight breaking through dense fog. He wanted to say something, but his throat closed up, and all he could do was smile and rest his hand on Sophie's tangled hair. You drew this beautifully, he said, his voice husky. It's really beautiful. Sophie beamed and ran back to hug her mother's legs, as if she needed to share her joy. Lillian looked at the drawing, then at Elliot, her eyes briefly surprised but filled with gratitude. Sophie loves to draw, she said softly. She says drawings are a way to keep the important things? Elliot nodded, still holding the picture tightly in his hand. He looked at the three figures holding hands, and a thought flashed through his mind, not pity, not duty, but a fierce desire. He wanted to protect them, not just because they needed help, but because he genuinely cared for them. Sophie, with her innocence and quiet courage. Lillian, with her quiet strength. They had become part of his world, a world he had thought frozen forever. That night, Elliot stayed much longer than he intended. Sophie eventually fell asleep in the armchair, clutching her stuffed rabbit, her drawing carefully placed beside her. Lillian, though still pale, was more alert thanks to the medicine and food. She sat across from Elliot, the space between them lit only by an old table lamp. Silence hung in the air, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the silence of people trying to understand each other without needing words. "Lillian," Elliot began, his voice low. He took a deep breath, as if preparing to cross a line he hadn't approached since Emma died. "Sophie reminds me of my daughter. I used to have a little girl, Emma. My wife died giving birth to her. She was only 5 when she left me. A car accident. I wasn't there when it happened. I was at the office like every other day, thinking work was everything." He stopped, his gaze drifting into empty space, as if he were seeing that rainy night again, the ambulance siren, and the hollow ache when he held Emma's cold body. Lillian listened, her eyes soft and full of empathy. She didn't interrupt. She simply reached out and rested her hand on his, a gentle gesture strong enough to pull him out of the painful memory. "I can't imagine that kind of pain," she said quietly. She paused, glancing at Sophie sleeping peacefully in the chair, then continued, as if Elliot's story had opened a door in her own heart. "Sophie, she isn't my biological daughter. I want you to know that because I think you deserve to understand us better." Elliot looked at her, surprised but not judging. Lillian took a slow breath, her voice trembling a little but steady. "Sophie is the daughter of Anna, my best friend. Anna died of cancer when Sophie was only a few months old. She had no family, no one to take care of Sophie. I couldn't let her grow up in an orphanage. Back then I was just a cleaning lady, living in this apartment with nothing but a job and a little hope. But I took Sophie in, and from that moment on, she became my whole world." Elliot sat silently, his gaze shifting to Sophie, still asleep with her stuffed rabbit in her arms. He felt deep respect for Lillian, a woman who had chosen to love a child not born of her body, despite how hard life had been. "You're a wonderful mother," he said sincerely. "Sophie is lucky to have you." Lillian smiled, a weak, tired smile, but warm. "She's the reason I get up every morning. No matter how hard things get, all I have to do is look at Sophie, and I find the strength to go on." She paused, looking at Elliot. "And you, Mr. Graves? You've done so much for us. I don't know why, but I know you have a big heart, even if you try to hide it." Elliot shook his head, a faint smile crossing his lips. "I'm not so sure about that," he said quietly. "But Sophie, she reminds me of Emma. And you, Lillian, you remind me that there are still things worth fighting for." He looked down at the crayon drawing on the table. The words, "our family," like an invitation. He didn't know if he could ever belong to any kind of family again, but for the first time in years, he wanted to try. Late that night, Elliot left the apartment, the drawing tucked safely in his pocket. He drove through the quiet streets, his heart heavy, but somehow lighter too. He thought of Sophie's question, "Our family," and for the first time, he felt that maybe love wasn't something too late to find again. He carefully folded the drawing and placed it in the glove compartment, as a reminder that he still had a chance to reclaim his heart. Morning light flooded the conference room on the 42nd floor of the Elysian Tower, reflecting off the long glass table and the expensive suits of the board members. The air was tense, heavy with scrutinizing stares and the rustle of papers being flipped. Elliot stood at the head of the table, composed in posture but with eyes sharp as a blade, like a man preparing to face a storm. In front of him lay the restructuring plan, a thick stack of documents filled with numbers and charts that had once been his pride, but now only suffocated him. Today, he wasn't here to defend that plan. He was here to dismantle it. "Ladies and gentlemen," Elliot began, his voice low and clear, echoing in the silent room. "I called this meeting to announce an important change. The plan to lay off our janitorial staff will be canceled in full. Instead, we will establish an emergency assistance fund dedicated to our most vulnerable cleaning employees, single mothers, immigrants, and those facing hardship. This fund will ensure they have better working conditions, from health insurance to financial support when needed." Silence hung over the room, but only for a few seconds. The scrape of a chair broke it, and Harold Vance, the company's largest shareholder, stood up. His face was red, his voice sharp as a knife. "Elliot, do you realize what you're saying? Cutting janitorial staff is the fastest way to optimize costs. We are competing against dozens of other firms. Throwing out this plan is shooting ourselves in the foot. And this assistance fund, where's the money coming from? Our pockets?" A murmur of agreement spread among the other shareholders. Some shook their heads, others rifled through their documents as if searching for arguments to counter him. Elliot stood tall, unmoved. He had anticipated this reaction, but this time he hadn't come to negotiate. He thought of Sophie, her pale blue eyes filled with hope when she handed him the crayon drawing. He thought of Lillian, the woman who had given 10 years to the company without a single day off, just to raise a child who wasn't even her own. Those images were stronger than any profit chart. "We don't just build skyscrapers," Elliot said, his voice calm but resolute, cutting through the whispers. "We have to protect the homes of the people who've kept this company clean for 20 years. Janitors like Lillian Hart, like the dozens of others on that list, aren't just employees. They are the foundation of Elysian. If we can't protect them, then the buildings we create mean nothing." His words plunged the room into silence again, but this time it was a different kind of silence. The silence of people caught off guard. A few glances exchanged, a few reluctant nods, but Harold Vance wouldn't yield. "This is personal sentiment, Elliot," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. "You're letting emotion drive business. Do you think the shareholders will stand by while you sacrifice profit because you feel like doing charity?" Elliot met Harold's eyes unflinchingly. "If our profit is built on the sacrifice of people like Lillian, then that's not profit I want," he said. "We will find other ways to optimize new technology, restructured processes, whatever it takes, but not by throwing the vulnerable out into the street." The meeting ended in tension. Some shareholders agreed, though reluctantly. Others still shook their heads. But Elliot didn't care. He had made his decision, and for the first time in years, he felt he was doing the right thing. When he left the boardroom, he left behind all the doubtful looks and walked straight back to his office. On his desk, Sophie's crayon drawing still lay there. The words, "our family," a reminder of why he had changed. Just a few days later, news of Elliot's decision spread everywhere. The major newspapers praised him as a humanitarian CEO, with headlines like, "Graves Design cancels layoffs, establishes janitorial support fund." Social media was full of posts about the leader with a golden heart. Some articles even dug into his past, mentioning Emma's loss as a driving force behind his transformation. But Elliot didn't read any of them. He didn't care about public opinion, about praise or criticism. In his heart, there was only the image of Sophie and Lillian, the little girl with the radiant smile, and the resilient woman who had taught him that love is never too late. That evening, Elliot returned to apartment 304, carrying a bag of groceries and a box of building blocks he thought Sophie would like. When he knocked, Sophie opened the door, her eyes bright as stars. "Mister!" she squealed, throwing her arms around his leg. Lillian stood behind her, looking healthier, though still a bit frail. Her gaze held gratitude and a touch of curiosity. "I heard about it on the radio," she said softly. "About you canceling the layoffs. You didn't have to do that because of me." Elliot shook his head and sat down beside Sophie, who was already tearing into the toy box. "Not just because of you, Lillian," he said. "Because of everyone like you, and because of Sophie, and because of me." He watched Sophie fit the colorful pieces together to build a tiny house, and he felt a glimmer of hope he hadn't known in years. Lillian smiled her first smile without any worry behind it. "You're a good man, Mr. Graves," she said, "no matter how hard you try to act cold." Elliot laughed a rare, genuine sound. He looked at Sophie, then at Lillian, and thought of the crayon drawing waiting on his desk. Our family? He didn't know if he could ever belong to any kind of family again. But this time, he wanted to try. Not because of the public, not because of reputation, but because he wanted to become the person Sophie and Lillian saw, a man with a heart. Rain poured down in torrents, as if the sky itself were crying for all the world's sorrows. The drops slammed against the glass windows, blending with the thunder that shook the city. Elliot Graves sat in his office on the top floor of the Elysian Tower, the dim desk lamp casting shadows across his face, where exhaustion was etched deeper than ever. His phone buzzed, shattering the silence. The screen lit up with Lillian Hart's number. A cold dread slid down his spine. He picked up, his voice tense. "Lillian? Mr. Graves." Lillian's voice on the line was ragged, broken by sobs. Sophie has a terrible fever. She won't wake up. The rain is too heavy. I don't have a car." Her voice cracked open, all the strength she had ever used to fight through life dissolving in an instant. "I can't lose Sophie. I can't." Her words were like a blade driven straight into Elliot's heart. He didn't answer right away. He simply shot to his feet, grabbed his coat, and rushed out of the office. "I'm coming," he said, his voice rough and trembling, as if he were trying to hold back a rising wave of terror. Rain, thunder, and the memory of the night he lost Emma, his 5-year-old daughter, swirled around him like a waking nightmare. That night had rained just like this, cold and merciless. He couldn't let history repeat itself. Not with Sophie. The Bentley sped down flooded streets, headlights dimming in the dense downpour. Elliot gripped the steering wheel so tightly his hands shook, almost beyond his control. In his mind, Emma appeared, her golden hair drenched, her eyes closed. He hadn't been there when she needed him most, trapped in a pointless meeting. Now every second felt like a battle against his own fear. The fear he would arrive too late again. The fear that Sophie, the little girl who had sparked a flicker of hope in him, would slip away the same way Emma had. When he reached the apartment building, he ran up the stairs, not caring that rain soaked through his expensive suit. Apartment 304's door was wide open. Lillian stood there, her face ashen, clutching Sophie in her arms. The child, wrapped in a thin blanket, lay limp, cheeks flushed scarlet with fever, eyes shut tight. Lillian looked at Elliot, tears streaking her face, her voice so shaky it barely sounded human. She won't answer me. Mr. Graves, I can't lose Sophie. She's everything I have." She clutched the little girl as if letting go would make her disappear. Elliot stepped forward, gently but urgently, taking Sophie from her arms. The girl's body was burning, each shallow breath as fragile as a thread. His heart clenched, terror squeezing his chest. "She's going to be okay," he said, his voice hoarse, as much to convince himself as her. "Come on, Lillian. I'm taking her to the hospital." Lillian nodded, hastily throwing on a raincoat, but her eyes were wide with dread, as if she were standing at the edge of a cliff. The drive to the hospital was a nightmare. Rain lashed the car, water hammering against the windows, mingling with Lillian's muffled sobs in the back seat. She held Sophie tight, whispering over and over, "Please, baby, don't leave me. Mommy's here." Her voice broke apart like a desperate prayer. Elliot glanced in the rearview mirror and saw Lillian's tear-streaked face, her hands trembling as she stroked Sophie's hair. He wanted to say something, anything to comfort her, but his throat closed tight. All he could do was drive faster, praying time wouldn't steal Sophie away like it had stolen Emma. At the hospital, nurses rushed Sophie into the emergency room. Elliot and Lillian stood in the hallway, rain still dripping from their hair and clothes onto the tile floor. Lillian hugged herself, shivering not just from the cold, but from the fear eating her alive. "I lost Anna," she whispered, her voice small, as if she were talking to herself. "Sophie's real mother. My best friend. I promised Anna I'd take care of her little girl. But if Sophie leaves me too..." She couldn't finish. More tears came, and she covered her face, trying to hide her despair. Elliot stood beside her, feeling his heart twist in his chest. He wanted to hold her, to tell her everything would be all right, but the memory of Emma left him paralyzed. He remembered the rain that night too, the night he'd run into a hospital only to hear that Emma was already gone. That fear and that grief rose inside him again, raw as an open wound. He looked through the glass at the doctors working on Sophie, and he silently prayed she wouldn't share Emma's fate. After what felt like an endless hour, the doctor stepped out, removing his mask, his voice steady but reassuring. She has a severe viral infection causing the fever, but we've managed to bring it down and started treatment. She'll be okay, she just needs rest and monitoring. Lillian broke down in sobs, throwing her arms around Elliot without caring about formality anymore. He stood frozen for a moment, surprised by the embrace. Then he slowly wrapped his arms around her, feeling her trembling against him. "Thank you," Lillian whispered, her voice ragged. "If you hadn't come, I don't know what I would have done." Elliot didn't answer. He just held her gently. They were led into the hospital room where Sophie lay in bed, her pale blue eyes open, tired but alive. When she saw Elliot, she gave a faint, fragile smile. "Mister," she whispered, her voice soft as a breath. Elliot sat down by the bed and took her small hand in his, feeling the fragile warmth of her fingers. His hands were still trembling, the fear of losing her not fully gone, but her steady gaze pushed back the darkness inside him. Sophie looked up at him, her eyes bright despite her weakness. "Mister," she said, her voice quiet but clear, "are you my daddy now?" The question was like a beam of light cutting through the night in Elliot's heart. He froze. Emma's face, her bright smile, calling him daddy, flashed through his mind. But this time the memory didn't only hurt. This time he saw Sophie, the child who had opened a door he thought would stay locked forever. He leaned down and carefully pulled Sophie into a gentle hug, making sure not to hurt her. "If you want me to be your daddy," he whispered, his voice breaking with emotion, "then I will be." His tears fell, silent, blending with the rain tapping against the hospital window. Lillian stood nearby, her own tears falling, but her smile glowed like sunlight after a storm. Sophie, still weak, squeezed his hand and whispered, "I want that." Then she closed her eyes, drifting into a peaceful sleep, her face calm as if she had never faced the fever. Elliot sat there holding Sophie, listening to her steady breathing. The rain outside was no longer a reminder of loss. Instead, it felt like a lullaby, whispering that no matter how painful the past had been, he still had a chance to love, to protect, and to become part of a new family. Gentle sunset light fell over the old apartment complex, softening the harsh edges of cracked walls. Inside apartment 304, the small space felt warmer not only because of the little heater Elliot had brought the week before, but because of the presence of new hope. After days of battling fever, Lillian Hart had recovered. Her cheeks had regained a little color, and her eyes, though still carrying the fatigue of long years of struggle, now shone with a glimmer of relief. Elliot Graves had done something he never imagined he would. He not only kept Lillian at the company, but he had promoted her. From an invisible cleaning lady, she was now the building services manager of Graves Design, with a salary enough to free her and Sophie from worrying about stale bread or expired cartons of milk. When he'd announced the decision, Lillian had looked at him, eyes wide, as if she couldn't believe life could change so quickly. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice trembling. Elliot had simply smiled and replied, "Because you deserve it, and because Sophie needs you." Tonight, Elliot stood in front of apartment 304 again, carrying a large paper bag filled with the dinner he'd prepared himself. A container of hot pumpkin soup, fragrant roasted chicken, creamy mashed potatoes, and a small apple pie he thought Sophie might like. He knocked on the door, feeling a nervous flutter in his chest like a schoolboy visiting someone special. Sophie opened the door, her pale blue eyes lighting up like stars when she saw him. "Mister," she squealed, hopping in place and hugging his leg. "What did you bring? It smells so good." Her worn-out stuffed rabbit was still clutched in her arm like a friend she would never let go. Lillian appeared from the little kitchen, wearing a simple sweater, her dark hair tied back. She smiled, though there was still a trace of shyness in it, as if she hadn't quite gotten used to Elliot being part of her life. Please come in, she said gently. I, I didn't know you were coming. The place is a little messy. Elliot stepped inside and set the bag on the old wooden table. Don't worry, he said, glancing around the apartment. It was still modest, but now there were signs of life everywhere. A small vase of flowers on the table, a few children's books stacked neatly, and Sophie's crayon drawings taped to the walls. I just thought having dinner together might be nice. Sophie had climbed onto a chair, peeking curiously into the bag. Mister, is there cake? She asked in her high, eager voice. Elliot laughed and pulled out the little apple pie, placing it in front of her. There is, but you have to eat your soup first, okay? Sophie nodded enthusiastically, then ran to the corner of the room and grabbed a piece of paper. I made this for you, she said, handing him a new crayon drawing. Elliot took the drawing, feeling a sharp pang in his chest, but this time it was warm. It was still 3 people holding hands, but now there was a little house with a smoking chimney, a bright yellow sun in the corner, and the word clumsily written, home. This is our home, Sophie explained, pointing to each figure. This is you, this is Mommy, and this is me. We all live together now, right? Lillian looked at the drawing, her eyes glistening with emotion. She turned away, hiding it by stepping into the kitchen to fetch 3 old cups and a pot of hot tea. Sophie, let him sit down a moment, she said, her voice gentle but unsteady. She poured the tea, her hands trembling as she set a cup in front of Elliot. You don't know how much you've saved us, she said, her voice so soft it was almost a whisper. Not just the job, everything. Sophie can go to school without being hungry. I don't know how to thank you. Elliot looked into her eyes and saw sincerity there, and the lingering fear that all this goodness might turn out to be a dream. He reached out and gently took her hand, a simple gesture that carried all the meaning in the world. You saved me too, he said, his voice low but steady. I've been living like a machine for years, Lillian. You and Sophie, you reminded me that life isn't just buildings or numbers. I want to thank you for that. Lillian blushed and pulled her hand back, trying to hide her embarrassment, but she couldn't hide the smile on her face. Sophie, oblivious to the grown-up's emotion, kept chattering about her school day. Today I learned about plants, mister, she announced brightly. My teacher says plants need sun and water just like I need Mommy. She giggled and pointed at the drawing. See? I drew the sun so our house will always be warm. Elliot smiled, a rare and genuine smile. He helped Lillian set the table, a simple meal, but arranged with care, like a ritual of belonging. They sat around the little wooden table, the old lamp casting a warm glow across their faces, creating a scene that felt cozy in its simplicity. Sophie ate hungrily, telling stories about her friends at school and a bird that had landed on the classroom window. Lillian gently reminded her to slow down between bites, but her eyes kept drifting to Elliot, as if she were still trying to understand the man who had walked into their lives like an unexpected breeze. When dinner was over, Sophie ran to get her crayons again, determined to draw another picture. Lillian started clearing the table, refusing Elliot's offer to help. You've already done enough, she said softly but firmly. But when she returned to the table, sitting across from him with her cold cup of tea, she added, You know, for the first time in years, I feel like I can dream of a better future. Not just for Sophie, but for me too. Elliot nodded, his gaze settling on Sophie's new drawing, taking shape on the floor. I feel the same, he said quietly. I used to think I didn't have any future outside my work, but now I want more. For you and Sophie. The room fell into a comfortable hush, broken only by the sound of Sophie's crayon scratching across paper and the soft rustle of evening wind against the window. This first dinner was more than a meal, it was the beginning of something larger. A silent promise that these 3 people from such different worlds were finding one another in the gentle light of love and hope. You're watching Soul Stories exclusive to our channel. If you're still with us, drop a comment we read and cherish them all. Subscribe to support more heartfelt, original stories. Thanks for being part of the Soul Stories family. A year had passed like a season changing its winds, bringing profound transformations, not only in Elliot Graves' heart, but in the entire empire he had built. The city park glowed in the weekend afternoon sunlight. Lush green trees swaying in the breeze. Children's laughter mingled with birdsong, creating a vibrant soundtrack of life. Along a gravel path, Elliot walked, his posture no longer rigid like the man who once lived in the top-floor office of the Elysian Tower. On his shoulders, Sophie, now 7 years old, laughed brightly, her brown hair tied high, flying behind her with each step. She held up a crayon drawing, her lines more refined than they were in those first days but still innocent. "Look, mister," Sophie called, her clear voice ringing out. "This is our family." The picture was familiar. Three people holding hands, standing before a house with smoke curling from the chimney, a golden sun in the corner, and the words carefully written, "Our family." Sophie pointed to each figure, explaining with excitement, "This is you, this is mommy, and this is me. And I drew a dog because I want us to have a puppy." Elliot laughed, a sound so natural and warm he hadn't believed. A year ago, he was still capable of it. He adjusted Sophie to sit more securely on his shoulders, his eyes bright with joy. "A puppy, huh? I'll have to talk to your mom about that," he teased, glancing over at Lillian walking beside him. Lillian smiled, her hand intertwined with his, a simple gesture, but full of meaning. She wore a pale blue dress, her black hair loose and soft, no longer matted by sweat or worry. Her job managing building services at Graves Design had given her stability, not just financial, but emotional. She was no longer the cleaning woman who kept her head down in the shadows, but a confident woman with a bright gaze when she looked at Sophie and Elliot. "Sophie, you're asking about a dog again," she said, her voice mock stern but unable to hide her smile. "You have to promise you'll take care of it." "I promise," Sophie squealed, holding the drawing higher like she wanted the whole world to see. Passers-by glanced over, some smiling, as if caught up in the little girl's joy. Elliot felt those looks too, but this time he felt no embarrassment or distance. This time he felt like he belonged to this moment, to these two people beside him. They stopped beside a wooden bench under a large oak tree. Elliot gently lifted Sophie down so she could run to a patch of grass and gather fallen leaves. He sat beside Lillian, their hands still joined. The space between them felt peaceful, needing no words. But Lillian eventually broke the quiet, her voice soft but full of feeling. "You changed everything, Elliot," she said, her eyes watching Sophie skipping across the grass. "Not just for me and Sophie, for so many people. I read about your company, about everything you've done." Elliot smiled, his expression tender but touched with surprise. A year ago, when he had stood before the board of directors to announce the cancellation of the layoffs and the creation of an emergency support fund for vulnerable janitorial staff, he had faced fierce resistance. Harold Vance, the largest shareholder, had called it foolish sentiment. But today, Graves Design hadn't just survived those grim predictions, it had flourished. Elliot's policies, comprehensive health insurance for janitors, financial aid for families in crisis had become a symbol. The company had landed multiple major contracts from new partners. "We want to work with you, the man with the golden heart," a CEO had said at one signing ceremony. Those words spread, and Graves Design's reputation was no longer only about its gleaming towers, but also about how it treated people. Board members who had once opposed Elliot's decision had changed their tune. Some, like Harold Vance, grudgingly admitted that his policies brought lasting benefits. Others who had quietly agreed from the start now openly supported him, even proposing expanding the fund to other branches. Elliot's emergency support fund had transformed the lives of dozens of families. Single mothers, immigrants, and workers who had once lived in fear of being let go could finally breathe easier. One janitor had written him a thank you letter, saying she finally had enough money to take her child for regular medical checkups for the first time in her life. Another sent him a card. Inside it, the shaky handwriting of a child. "Thank you for helping my dad." Elliot's model didn't stop at Graves Design. Other corporations began to follow, improving benefits for lower-level employees, establishing similar funds. A City Times article called him a pioneer of a new era of business where profit and compassion walk hand in hand. But Elliot didn't care about the praise. He only thought about Sophie and Lillian, two people who had pulled him out of his own darkness. "You and Sophie were the ones who changed me," he said to Lillian, his voice low but certain. "I used to think I wasn't capable of love anymore, that losing Emma was the end. But the two of you opened that door again. Lillian squeezed his hand tighter, her eyes glistening. You gave us a home, she whispered. Not just a job, but the feeling that we were safe, that we weren't alone. Sophie came running back, hugging her drawing to her chest. Mister, Mommy, will we always be a family? She asked, her pale blue eyes shining with hope. Elliot looked at Lillian, saw her nod, and then bent down to wrap Sophie in his arms. Yes, he said, his voice catching. We are a family. As the sun set, the three of them walked out of the park together. Sophie walked in the middle, holding both Elliot's and Lillian's hands. Her crayon drawing was tucked safely in Elliot's hand, like a precious treasure. He looked at the two people beside him, and for the first time in his life, he felt he had truly come home. Elliot Graves had once believed loss had locked away all love inside him. For years, in the tall office surrounded by numbers and blueprints, he had lived like a machine, convinced nothing could ever change that pain. But two fragile hearts, Sophie, with her bright smile and her crayon drawings, and Lillian, with her quiet resilience, had taught him a simple, profound lesson. Love is never too late. And in the golden dusk of an ordinary day, beneath the trees of the park, he had found a new family bound not by blood, but by the invisible threads of hope and love.